Shabbat Shalom, my friends. Well, our conversation this week is going to be very different. Several days ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to study with Micha Goodman, a brilliant professor of Jewish studies, prolific author, and a research fellow at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Micha is young, dynamic, warm, and amazingly insightful regarding biblical texts that we have all studied for years and yet somehow never really explored. So Micha was in Los Angeles, obviously. I drove out to the valley to learn from him, and to my delight, he was focused on our Sedra, the Sedra for this week, Mishpatim. So I want to share with you Micha's unique take on the text. Every suggestion or assertion that follows comes from Micha, my teacher. I offer you this gift, B'Shem Amro, with full disclosure as to its origins. Now, here we go. Exodus 21:1 opens our Sedra with a discussion of what is called the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew Israelite slave. It says we are to treat this person, though still a slave, with serious concern for his humanity. Fine. But note that our Sedra Mishpatim immediately follows last week's Sedra, Yitro, the Sedra that contains the Ten Commandments. Now, the word Mishpatim means statutes, rules, the nitty-gritty of social living. So we see that the very first of those commandments that follow, the Big Ten, deals with a Hebrew slave. Now we know that nothing happens by chance in the Torah. So what connects the Eved Ivri with the Big Ten? Go back with me to Exodus 20, verse 1, which is where the Ten Commandments begin. The first four commandments deal with relationships ben Adam lemakom, relationships between Adonai and humankind. The first commandment introduces God to us. We know this. I am the eternal your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Fine. God say, hi, I'm God. I'm the liberator. Terrific. Hello, God. You are the one who sent the plagues and split the sea. Okay, we identify you with those acts. You are the liberator. Got it. Okay, next commandment. Don't have any other gods. Okay, cool. That makes sense. You are God. You, God, are the only one. Next, don't make any images. Already we have a problem. The ancients believed that part of the very essence of any God to be worshipped is to be found inside the idols, the images we make of that God. If we don't have any images into which the essence of the God we're worshiping can be entered, then we can't worship any gods at all. God seems to be saying to us that we shouldn't be worshiping God. Does that make any sense at all? Okay, moving on. Don't swear by God's name. Okay, here the list is building. We can't make images. We can't invoke God to show how serious we are about something. What's next? Okay, hit pause. Do you remember what happens right after the Ten Commandments were given by God to Moses at Sinai? The people cry out to God, stop! Stop speaking directly to us, God. We can't handle it, too powerful. You speak with Moses. Moses will speak with us. That we can survive. So let's go back. What do we have here? God says hello, and then basically severs all back and forth communication with the people. No images, no invoking, no direct communication. Next up, Shabbat, the commandment about the Sabbath. This is the first affirmative commandment in the Big Ten. We are to keep the Shabbat. Why? Because God, the God of creation, did something called Shabbat on the seventh day. So we renew creation every day by treating Shabbat as a standalone. So by Shabbating every seventh day, we become creators like God, the capital C creator. We don't really have an exact word. You've noticed my stumbling around a little bit for what Shabbat as a verb actually means. We don't really know what it means, but whatever it is, we have to Shabbat because that's what God does. So the rationale for Shabbat is for us to act the way that God acts. Imitation of God. The best worship of the liberator God, the creator God, is for us to imitate what we understand to be the defining activities of God. It's not worship. Idols are out. It's not conversation because we just can't speak directly with God. It's not invoking. We worship God by imitating. Maybe God would have preferred some form of direct contact with us, but our ancestors literally, physically recoiled from such a possibility. For them, for us, forever. Our highest service of God will be imitating the manner in which we perceive God to be acting in our world. Let's look again at that Evet Ivri, the beginning of our Sedra, the Hebrew slave. That's the first post-Big Ten commandment. We actually might even call it the 11th commandment. And remember, this is what we've learned. The 11th commandment, the Evet Ivri, is the first commandment transmitted to God and by God through Moses, Moses to us. It's the first commandment Moses gives us directly. God is a liberator God. Thus this commandment, so we must be a liberating people. God implicitly says, I liberated you from Egypt, I freed the slaves. Now you must become a people that liberates others. This is how you will serve me. You want to get close to me? Then be like me. Do as I do. Let's go back to the Shabbat commandment for a minute. God doesn't stop being active on Shabbat. God does whatever it is that Shabbat implies. God changes the divine pattern of activity. God does differently on Shabbat than that which God does the other 6 days. God, forgive me, did a major Shabbating at the end of creation, a one-time thing. We are to do Shabbat once a week, every week, in imitation of God. By modeling after God, we are offering God the noblest, holiest form of service. Imitation of God becomes the truest worship of God. Once we realize all of this, once we realize that God is liberation, that we can understand that creating more comfortable conditions for a Hebrew slave acknowledges the very humanity of that slave and therefore is the first step toward recognizing, the liberation of all slaves. The experience of the Exodus is now being turned from a recitation of miraculous history into a window as to how we experience God's demands upon us. For me, this week, sitting with Micha Goodman, this was breathtaking. We eat matzah to imitate our people's experience in Egypt. We live in Sukkot to imitate our people's wandering in the desert. We show love for the stranger to imitate the reverse, if you will, of what we felt as slaves in Egypt. We loved the other to imitate, because we experienced what hatred is all about, and we want to model a different form of human behavior. Rabbinic tradition happens to be filled with all kinds of descriptions as to how God fills the divine day. God puts on tefillin in the morning. God adds beautiful decorations to new Torah scrolls. God weeps when the Israelites are in trouble. God engages with the angels when trying to determine what are the next steps necessary to make the Israelites really into a holy people. God judges. God forgives. God is profoundly concerned with the weakest, the most vulnerable. God brings peace to a battered world. These are the commandments to define for us how to really worship God. So Micha Goodman has shown how we can derive a rich new interpretation out of some of our most ancient texts. We are to act according to how we understand God's behaviors to be. We are to worship God by loving peace and pursuing it. We are to worship God by seeking freedom for all. We are to worship God by forgiving. We are to worship God by studying Torah. We are to worship God by feeling the pain of others. We are to worship God by lifting up the fallen. No sanctuary, no matter how grand, can be more glorious than the presence of a people dedicated to live in imitation of God. Thank you, Micha Goodman. What a joy it was to study with you this week. And thank all of you who've chosen to join our conversation today. Please hit share. It's been an interesting phenomenon the past few weeks. More people have come, the more you share. And then have a beautiful seventh day of the week in which you define for yourselves how you Shabbat. See you next week.